All right, so chapter 20, Africa and the slave trade, especially which part of the slave trade? The Atlantic slave trade. Okay, good. Before we start, a few questions for you to think about. These do not necessarily have a right answer. This is more just kind of to get your brain engaged with what we're learning about. Maybe. Possibly. There we go. All right, so the first one. In general, what characteristics must exist in order for the enslavement of one people by another to occur? More simply put, what do you have to have slavery? Paul? Someone who has more power. Now, let's talk about power for a moment. What kinds of power are required? Okay, so physical power, being able to physically overpower them, either with the physical strength of your body or perhaps through technology, like with a gun. All right, what else, Nick?
Political power. So
how so?
The power to say that you have to do this, because I am your ruler. I am the person who you elected, or I am the member of the family who you believe is the rightful ruler of the area.
Good. So political power or authority, either in the family or in the country, that gives you the right to make these sorts of decisions. And oftentimes that political power is backed up by what? Physical power, right. What else, Sahil? Religious trust. Explain.
Like, for instance, if you're held in because of religion, essentially your God or belief would say that this person is the rightful person and you should agree with him because you agree with me.
Good. So sometimes it's not just political authority, it's religious authority, and so your religion puts you in a position of power, and therefore your decisions are supported by God, and therefore shouldn't be questioned either. All right, anything else? Mari? Economic. How so? Good. Economic power. If you have more money than somebody else, you possibly have a means of control. How many of you would do some very unpleasant and or disgusting things, like, clean out gutters, clean bathrooms, if somebody offered you a lot of money? Yeah, absolutely. Some of you are like, Psh, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, right. I have cleaned poopy bathrooms before. I worked in a gas station for 2 years when I was in high school. I have seen some nasty bathrooms, and I was only making $6.50 an hour. Somebody offered me $10,000 to clean the poopiest bathroom on the planet. Absolutely, I'm there. Because it's not that bad, really. I mean, boots and gloves, you're fine. Just don't slip and fall. The flip side of all of this, you have to have one or more of these forms of power. But who has to be on the receiving end? Right, somebody that has to be significantly weaker in one or more of those areas. So somebody that is physically weaker, or politically weaker, or religiously weaker, or economically weaker. You need both parts. You need somebody that is overwhelmingly more powerful, and it kind of stands to reason, but you need that second party. All right, here's another one for you. It's kind of a chicken versus the egg argument. Which one came first? African political expansion causing the slave trade? Or did the slave trade cause African kingdoms to expand and become more powerful? Tarina? Why? How?
Because they expanded, making themselves more social with other places, causing them to be noticed by other countries. And they saw it as them being different and everything, like other countries trying to have.
Okay, so one option is they expand on their own, natural desire to expand, just like every other civilization we've ever studied. As a result of expanding, they become more powerful, attract attention, and it goes from there. All right, Stephen. Mm-hmm.
We get more slaves.
Okay, and so the opposite option is still available. Because of investment in the slave trade by outsiders, it allows these kingdoms to become more wealthy, which allows them to expand, sometimes with help, sometimes just with resources, which allows them to get more slaves, and it's cyclical at that point. It keeps building. Both good options. Paul?
Didn't the Europeans come in not wanting slaves at first, though?
Very good. The Europeans do come in and at first just help facilitate the existing slave trade. So another way to look at it is the slave trade was going before the white folk ever showed up.
So this isn't about the white folks.
Right, so it's not even necessarily about Europeans. Nick?
I'm going to say that slave trade caused it because the mere fact that kingdoms like Dahomey and Benin formed in West Africa, taking out Songhai,
Mm-hmm.
because they had guns that they bought from the Portuguese, and they also had slaves, so they'd sell slaves, get more guns, take over more people.
But what about the slave trade that existed before the Europeans ever showed up to sell them
That
guns?
was mostly like trans-Saharan or along the Indian Ocean. There really was no slave trade coming out of Western Africa except for the smaller trans-Saharan slave trade. So they rose up to, those kingdoms became kingdoms because of the Atlantic slave trade.
So this may be a geographic argument. In some places, the kingdom came first and the slave trade followed. In other places, maybe like West Africa, like you're saying, maybe the slave trade came first and the kingdom followed.
Yes.
Anybody want to know what the right answer is? Good job. There isn't one. Here's one. Is slavery bad? How many people don't want to touch this one? That's part of the question. I've already heard several great questions about this question. Bad for who? Are we talking about morally? Yes, ma'am.
I can't remember what then, that's just how it was. Like to us, obviously, yes, now it's realized it can be bad, and it's just not morally right to us. But back then, that's just how things were.
Okay. So some of this maybe isn't so much a question of moral or ethical behavior, but it's a question of what was. And at the time, slavery existed. And so looking back with modern day hindsight isn't necessarily fair. Judging them by 21st century standards and saying, oh, you bad people, is in some ways hypocritical, if not worse. Tarina?
Not all slavery is bad.
Explain. Right. Keep going.
But then there's some slavery, like the slaves in Russia, they were treated very poorly in Africa.
Right. So again, some of this, like with the last question, might be geographical. Slaves in some places might have it much better than slaves in other places. And again, like we've talked about before, no child will ever grow up going, Mommy, Daddy, I want to be a slave. But there certainly are differences. Sahil?
Well, at the time, like when all this was happening, like slavery was straightforward and social they got it right because it's always been a takeover. There's always been that as in slavery.
So because it's such a long-standing part of hierarchies, why even question it? It's not bad or good, it just is. Okay, Nick?
Well, slavery is like the white, it's not the white elephant, it's more of like the elephant in the room
Okay.
of society because it's there, but we don't want to really think about it. Look at the great architectural wonders of the world and societies. The pyramids of Giza were built with slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
The Roman Colosseum was built to have slaves fight to the death against each other.
Right.
Great Wall.
The Great Wall was built by slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, slavery may be morally wrong, but the practice of slavery has gotten us to where we are today.
Well, and that's a great point that's worth discussing, is there's always two sides to the issue of slavery. There's what slavery does to the slaves, and there's what slavery does to society. And again, we're not going to put a moral point on it right now, but you're right. That's always one of the justifications is, yeah, it might suck to be a slave, but look what slaves can be used for. You know, I don't want to be a slave, but, look at all the benefits. You're right. That is one of the fundamental issues throughout history. Is slavery okay? Is the use of slavery okay? And we seem to go in very different directions with that. Alia and then Stephen?
Would we have survived in the America without slave labor?
That's a great question. Would we have survived in the Americas without slave labor? I don't know. I mean, the northern colonies, the New England colonies didn't really need them. The southern colonies wouldn't have done very well at all without them. The Caribbean colonies, Central America, South America, existed almost exclusively because of slave labor. Your book talked about the fact that, in what will become the United States, slaves made up no more than 25% of the population, which seems huge, until you look at the Caribbean colonies and you see that there, slaves were 90% of the population. Yeah. Wow is right. So it's a great question. What would have happened to the entire Western Hemisphere without slavery? I'm not smart enough to answer that one. Stephen, what were you going to say? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Like Nick and like Alia brought up, what would have happened had slavery not existed? How might history have been different? I don't know. All right, Paul, last one. Oh, and Emily, okay.
And that, it all depends on who the master was. Some slaves ended up running away, while some, when they get freed, they stay there just because they want to. It's like a good home.
Yeah, yeah. And that's another great point, is we have to be very careful of the mental picture that we build up in our head of what a slave is. I mean, by definition, a slave is simply someone who is not free to make their own decisions. And right away, especially to teenagers, that sounds like the worst possible thing in the world. But you're right, Paul. I mean, depending on who is controlling the slave, slavery wouldn't have to be that bad. It doesn't mean that you have to be poorly treated. It doesn't mean that you have to be starved or beaten or deprived of your human dignity. It might just simply mean that somebody else is making decisions for you, and those decisions happen to be pretty good and beneficial. So it's a great point to bring up, is it's how we use this term slavery rather than, the entire idea itself. Emily?
When we were doing the kind of seminar on Greek the pros and cons, or
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about the pros and cons of slavery in Rome. And so you're right, slavery did help to accomplish a lot, but some of it held Rome back.
Mm-hmm.
And sending in executives and stuff. So I feel like everything kind of has its pros and cons.
That's a great point. Everything does have its pros and cons, including slavery. And I mean, that was a great connection back to Rome. I mean, yeah, Rome benefited from slave labor, but it also slowed their growth of ideas. They're like, how do we solve this problem? We need more food. Well, we could take the time to come up with brand new ideas and then test new inventions and see if they work, expect many of them to fail, and then try again. And 100 years from now, we might solve the problem. Or we can get more slaves. Problem solved tomorrow. Done. Right. Now, you would think, hopefully, you try to do both. But how do you resist the temptation of that easy solution of just throw more slaves at the problem? We got to increase production. Okay, more slaves. We need to expand across more territory and, open up more farmland. More slaves. I mean, how do you avoid that? It's a good point. All right, so now that we've muddied the waters a little bit and made slavery even more confusing, let's talk about Africa. Now, when we last were in Africa in this book, it was way, way back in chapter 8. And we were talking about 3 major kingdoms, which were Ghana, Mali, Songhai. And those were all located where? West Africa. And so we've hung on to the last one for you. And this map is in your textbook. But you see Songhai here in the blue circle. So kind of that southeastern portion of that bump of Africa. Ghana and Mali and Songhai all occupied more or less the same territory. What we're going to see is that as we reach this early modern era of history, as we get into the Atlantic slave trade, the power in Africa will shift down the coast. And like Nick was talking about earlier, these new kingdoms will crop up almost exclusively as a result of the slave trade. Not just with Europeans, but that will certainly be a huge contributor. And so as we get through the end of the 1500s, Songhai will be on its way out and decline, and these new centers of power, Ashanti, Dahomey, Benin, Congo, will become the new dominant African kingdoms. And we've hit on this a few times, so just to touch on it once more, please, please, please remember that slavery existed in Africa before the white folk ever showed up. Europeans did not invent slavery. Europeans did not cause slavery. Europeans did not force Africans to be slaves.
They just got involved.
Right, they got involved in an existing institution. Now, we're going to stop right there for just a half second and say that in no way absolves them of all the horrific things that happened as a result of their slave trade. We're not trying to give Europeans a pass on this and say, well, they weren't so bad. I mean, look, it was happening already. They were the good guys. No. No, 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 no.
We're just not making them out to be worse than they were.
Right. We're just making sure that they aren't also blamed for things that they didn't do.
Proper amount of...
Right, right. We're trying to find the accurate level of responsibility that they have here. So, slave trade did already exist.
Almost like playing devil's advocate a bit, but not enough to like...
Well, it's again more trying to get rid of maybe some of the distorted views that you had from your earlier years of school where they just made it overly simplified and they're like, oh, white people started slavery in Africa. That's easier to grasp for a 9-year-old than the complexities of, well, you know, there were African kingdoms already in Africa. And you're like, where's Africa? It's over there, don't worry about it. But there were all these African kingdoms, and they had different tribal chiefs, and they were based on different religions, and they sometimes fought these flower wars with their neighbor. You're like, I need to go pee. So we oversimplify it then. Now you're old enough and potty trained, and we can do this. Most of you. All right, so again, it's important to remember, slave trade was already taking place. It was done within and between these different African kingdoms. They would fight wars with their neighbors, wars of conquest, just like Europe was doing, except here we were not looking for large-scale battlefield fatalities. You were looking for captives, prisoners of war, that you could then sell far, far away, get them out of your hair, and make a profit on them at the same time. Nick?
Why does it seem like only when Europe is involved, there are more large-scale casualties and death?
Europeans fight differently. And again, some of this I may be making up and or oversimplifying. But if you look at the way that Europe develops, where they're all in close proximity, and they don't like each other. I mean, for some reason, you have all these different ethnic groups throughout Western Europe and Central Europe that, and again, when we don't look at history as inevitable, when we see history as a series of choices, the option clearly existed long, long, long ago for all these European ethnic groups to get along and establish a mammoth European nation.
Or ignore each other.
Right, or ignore each other and choose isolation. And instead, they chose rivalry, competition, and conflict. Now, the reasons for those choices are incredibly complex and date back thousands of years. But at some point, those choices were made. In Africa, they made different choices. They chose to have smaller scale conflicts, and they chose for these conflicts to result in captives and not as often in casualties. And so again, not good, bad, or otherwise, just different. And again, in big bold letters at the bottom, slavery is not the slavery that you most often think of. Slaves captured in Africa are not guaranteed to be forced into a life of abject servitude and physical punishment and deprivation. Sometimes, and again the key word is sometimes, slaves are capable of getting out of slavery and even into positions of power. Sometimes they stay a slave their whole life, and sometimes being a slave sucks. But sometimes being a slave wasn't quite so bad as we would assume.
And sometimes they were stuck in a not so bad position until they were
Right.
too old, too worthy, to like offer something, right?
Right. So we want to broaden your definition of slavery. We want to begin to shake up some of these mental pictures where when I say slavery, there's an image that pops in your head and it's ugly. We don't want to remove that image.
You want to give it a more specific spot.
Well, we want to add to it. We want to give you multiple images so that when you hear the word slavery, you have an educated understanding of all the things that term could mean. We good here? Okay. Larger version of this map. Let me show you a couple other things that you may not have noticed because, again, as we all know, when you guys see pictures in your book, what do? You skip it. There are dates on Africa. This shows you the Portuguese progression down the coast. What do you notice that is perhaps surprising about these dates?
What is the time apart?
All right, there's quite a lot of time in between, about 20 years, 5 years, 25 years. What else do you notice? What else is maybe surprising? Nick?
A lot of stuff already in place in the start trading.
Okay, there's a lot of stuff that's already in place, especially when the more famous Portuguese explorers Bartolomeu Diaz and Vasco da Gama do their explorations. What else? Who do we typically associate as the first European to get on a boat and go sail? Right, Columbus. That's kind of our 4th grade view, right? And when does Columbus sail the ocean blue? 1492. 60 years before Columbus's voyage. The Portuguese are already exploring coastal Africa.
It takes them 19 years to go from there to there.
Well, honestly, the question was, why did it take them so long to go from here to here? And there's no reason to go further given the dangers, because you're going here for trade. And that's one of the other things to remember, is that Europeans did not go to Africa for slaves right away. What did they go for? Gold, pepper, salt, and animal skins. So if you can go that far and get it, why drive that far? It's like if I need to go to the grocery store, I go to Giant because it's a block away. I don't drive to Leesburg to go to Wegmans. It doesn't make sense.
Do the Africans up north know about the Africans that there were people that were found?
That's a great question. Do the people up here know about the people down here? To an extent, in some capacity, probably. And I don't think I can qualify it any more than that. But yeah, now, do people here have an exacting understanding of the entire continent? No, I don't know, and it probably depends on where you are. Do we have people here that have a very fuzzy grasp of the rest of the United States in the 21st century? Yeah. If we asked you all to fill out a map of the U.S. and asked you to pinpoint cities, would we have some people that could not find major portions of the U.S.? Yeah. But are there people throughout Africa that would have a much clearer understanding of what's happening? Yes. All right. Let's talk about when the Europeans first show up. Now, your book is using this term factory to describe what the Portuguese are building when they first show up. Please, please, please do not think of smokestacks. I know. So down there at the bottom of the page, It's not a factory with smokestacks. The picture on the bottom right is what these factories looked like. And this one's actually in India, because I couldn't find a picture of one in Africa. But the same thing holds basically true. It's a fort. It's a walled-in plot of land that gives them a feeling of safety and security, with a few essential buildings either as living quarters or storage or offices. That's what a factory is in this context. Yes, sir. Good question. So do these factories produce anything? Not in the way that you think of factories. Again, this is a fort. This is a place for Europeans to go and live and work and feel safe in a strange land. Now, it does help them acquire trade goods. This becomes a base of operations. So instead of, kissing your wife goodbye and hopping in your boat each day for your morning commute down the coast of Africa, 2 weeks later you get there, you make a trade because you're in a hurry to get home when you come back. That's not a good way to do business. So instead you set up shop in Africa and you live there for months or even years on end. And you do daily business with the African tribes and kingdoms. And then every 2 weeks or so, a Portuguese ship is going to come sailing down the coast to pick up all the things that you've bought and sold and take it back home to Portugal. And maybe if you're good, in 6 months or a year, you get to go home and they send somebody else. If you're not already dead from malaria. Right. Other things to help break some stereotypes. Europeans cannot dominate Africa from the get-go. They don't have the technology. The African kingdoms are actually more powerful, even though they don't have guns yet. There are so many people in the African kingdoms. The Europeans couldn't overpower them if they wanted to. Now, quick connection. Hernan Cortez invades the Aztecs and with 455 guys conquers an empire of tens of thousands. Why is this different?
Because they had already gotten into the very depth of the kingdom of Earth.
Nope. I heard it over here someplace. Disease. The Aztecs were susceptible to European diseases and died by the thousands without ever having a shot fired. What is not the case in Africa?
The Africans are the ones who are giving disease to the Europeans.
Well, the Africans aren't giving diseases to the Europeans.
But they're the ones who are resistant to them.
Right. Africa is part of the old world biological community. They already have many of the same immunities that Europeans do to diseases, like smallpox and measles and things like that. So the only weapon Europeans have at their disposal is guns. And putting 80 guys on a ship and coming down to an African kingdom of thousands of people, those aren't good odds. So when the Europeans establish these factories, they have to ask permission. So again, get that stereotype out of your head. The Portuguese do not come in with guns blazing. This is not some old western where they walk into town with their 6-gun on their hip and say, I'm the sheriff in this town now. No, they walk in, they're like, hey, your majesty, cool kingdom, you're awesome, tiger skin, nice. Is it okay if I have a teeny tiny piece of land to set up shop here? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, 1,000 times thank you. Emily?
Would they buy the land?
It's not necessarily going to be possession of land so much as permission to build buildings on this spot and use it to engage in trade with the kingdom.
So the trade is kind of like a continuous payment to rent the land.
Right. Yeah, rental is a much better way of looking at it. Sahil?
So like every time they went to the shore, how many of these factories would they locate?
I mean, you might have one for a major coastal kingdom. And then if you make another relationship with another kingdom, you might build one. You're not going to have the need for dozens of these because that would take up too much space. Nick?
Isn't it also true, comparing the Africans to the Aztecs, that these African kingdoms weren't pissing off as many people by sacrificing them?
Well, they are fighting wars with their neighbors and selling the, losers into captivity. So I think you're still going to have those same rivalries, and that's something that Europeans will be able to exploit as they learn more about these kingdoms. Cortez just happened to walk into a sweet situation that he was able to exploit. All right, here's something else to jumble up your understanding of what's happening. Europeans are actually impressed by African kingdoms. Yes, they are scared. Yes, they are surprised by what they see. Yes, they do think that these people in Africa are kind of weird. But they're also really impressed with the wealth and the splendor of these African kingdoms. It's not like they want to suddenly move down there and abandon Portugal, but they are legitimately impressed. So when does all this turn into racial slavery? It's when the Europeans find a reason to need slaves. Prior to this point, slavery is not common in Europe. We found this on our reading quiz last class. Where was the only place that slavery was common anywhere in European society?
The southern Mediterranean.
All right, any place where there was wars between Christians and Muslims. That was the only place where you were finding slavery. No place else in Europe was slavery commonly practiced. There was no need for it. Emily?
Did they use the slaves as soldiers?
No. The few slaves that the Portuguese take back, you see this statistic here, before 1450 there were 50 slaves taken back to Portugal per year. Those are being taken back most likely as domestic servants. A housekeeper, a maid, a chauffeur, a doorman, and it was an oddity. Like some people will travel and they'll bring back masks or, dishes or jewelry, something exotic, and they'll go and they'll show it off and be like, oh, look at this, I got this from my trip to wherever. And people are like, ooh, that's so special. So you're like, oh, look at this African slave I brought back. Isn't he, look at him. And your dinner guests will be like, ooh, wow, we don't have that. But other than that, there was not a high demand for African slaves until Europeans colonize these two islands, or sets of islands, the Madeira Islands and the Canary Islands. They're tropical. Pretty beaches, palm trees, all that stuff. And on that land, Europeans discover that they can successfully grow a very valuable cash crop called sugarcane. Sugarcane is hugely labor intensive. It takes a lot of bodies working a lot of hours to profit from sugarcane. Now you have a use for lots and lots of labor. And so this is why 10 years later you see the number of slaves begin to ratchet up. Portuguese traders now have a reason to buy slaves, to take them back to those two island colonies just off the coast and use them to grow sugar. Now, let's play what if. What if Columbus's boat sinks and no other European countries decide to invest in Western exploration? What happens to slavery from Africa? It goes to the Canary and Madeira Islands, and once those are pretty well full up, what happens to the European involvement in the African slave trade? They won't need them. Imagine how differently this would have played out had the Western Hemisphere not been discovered. What's that? Well, following Columbus's voyage, so 1492. Right.
Someone else has found this actually.
Well, somebody else would have eventually found it. Well, but the question would have been, would it have happened at a time when manual labor would not have been nearly as important? Would economies have progressed to the point where, slave labor would not have been as profitable?
Would have been a point where technology would have been advanced, they used electricity and light bulbs and more advanced machines.
Right, and that's the question.
You'd be able to direct the direction you want to go much more easily without the use of wind and motion.
Right. But that's not what happened.
Wow.
So, the Western Hemisphere is obviously discovered, and the Europeans, after exploring some of these tropical islands and communities, discover, this looks a lot like this. And if we could grow sugar here, we can grow sugar here. And to grow sugar, it takes a lot of labor. Now, you do not have this map in your book, but you do have this map on the PowerPoint. David, can you stop? So just for a moment, let's show you a few of the different parts of this. 1.25 million slaves within the trans-Saharan slave trade. So 1.25 African slaves that never leave Africa. You've got another 500,000 that go to the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire in the Middle East, that would never have been exposed to a European. So we're up to almost 2 million Africans already that have no part whatsoever in this Atlantic slave trade. So, again, breaking stereotypes. There's a slave trade going on that has very little to do with Europeans. You've got another 700,000. If you read the article I gave you last class on the Indian Ocean slave trade, here's another 700,000 that go from East Africa to India. So we're well over 2 million at this point. So it's not just slavery here. Let's stop oversimplifying this issue.
It's all over the Western and
Yeah, it's going both ways. But let's look at it over here. Brazil, which belongs to which European power? Portugal, 3.6 million. 3.6 million African slaves come to Brazil.
Question?
Sure.
What are the languages that are like the national languages there?
Today?
Yeah, today.
Well, the dominant language is Portuguese.
Okay, I was just wondering if there were like any other languages.
Oh, there are. But yeah.
Like ones like national, official ones you see on like listed on like Wikipedia pages, one
Mhm.
next to them or something.
Yeah. Portuguese is one of the two most dominant.
Okay.
All right, other ones. Northeast portion of South America gets 500,000. What will eventually be Venezuela and Colombia, 300,000. Southern Mexico, over 1 million. Cuba and Jamaica, 750,000 each. All these small, teeny tiny, great vacation islands, I've been to some of these. They're gorgeous. Barbados, Antigua, I love them. They each become slave colonies with 250,000 slaves or more on each of them. Now, look at this.
I see it.
North America. 400,000. Yeah, exactly. Compared to all of this that we just looked at. You look at this and you're like, that's it?
Not so much later, right?
It's because they couldn't grow sugar here. So it's like, what's the point? Cotton and tobacco, not that big a deal.
The number up through 1867.
What's that?
Is this the number up through 1867 roughly?
Yes.
So the 400,000 in North America.
This is importing.
Importing.
What's different about this is that here slaves are bred. Here slaves are worked to death and then new ones are brought in. the North American colonies were not receiving large quantities of slaves because it wasn't profitable. So North American plantation owners recognized that the only way to secure their slave population was to engage in a program of breeding slaves and then enslaving the offspring of their slaves as well, which is how you turn 400,000 into 4 million by the time of the Civil War. So again, far more complex than we realize. All right, so let's look at Africa. Like Nick mentioned earlier, we do have some African kingdoms that become powerful simply by virtue of the slave trade. And they become powerful because they receive firearms in trade from Europeans. And this will lead us to something called the gun-slave cycle. African kingdoms get guns, it makes them more effective in warfare, which gives them more captives. If they have more captives, they can sell more people as slaves. Selling more slaves gets you more guns. More guns equals more captives equals more slaves equals more guns. Let's assume at some point an African kingdom said, you know what? We are killing our country. We are killing Africa. We want to stop this. I will not sell another slave to another European ever again. I don't care if I never see another gun in my life. What's going to happen?
They get conquered by somebody with more guns.
They get conquered by somebody with more guns. So once you've entered into this cycle, you're kind of stuck. And so even though... Right. So even though this trade is largely controlled by the African rulers, once you get into this, you're kind of stuck because you know that the people around you are trading for guns as well. And if you fall behind, you lose the advantage, and you could pretty much guarantee that someday, not too far from now, you would be enslaved instead. Now, we do also see that there are examples of the stereotypical raiding and kidnapping that we usually assume Europeans engaged in. And if you read that article that I gave you from King Nzinga Mbemba, the king of the Congo, if you didn't read it, you have to read it. It's so, so powerful. He talks about how the Portuguese and his kingdom are engaging in that kind of theft of people. They're actually stealing upper-class people, branding them with the slave mark to make it look like they were officially bought as slaves, and throwing them on the boat. They're stealing the sons of his advisors. They're stealing his advisors. And they're making it look legit. And the king's like, what am I supposed to do about this? He's realizing very quickly he no longer has control, and that the king of Portugal is free to do pretty much whatever he wants. Well, because Portugal is quickly eclipsed by many other nations that get in on the slave trade as well, like the Dutch and the French and the English. Well, and that's why, is because Portugal is quickly eclipsed by these other European nations, and they stop being a dominant power. Stephen? Yeah, Portugal and Spain and Italy and Greece and yeah.
Everywhere but
France and Germany, yeah. Nick?
Now,
Okay.
Can we hold on a bit?
Yeah. I'm not going to change the slide yet. James?
What do you mean by Asante and Dahomey?
Those are the two new kingdoms in Africa. Now again, we talked about earlier, there are pros and cons to the slave trade. All of the wealth that the African rulers get does benefit their society, even as it makes it more challenging with the loss of population.